What's up, you geeks? For our first time together, we are going to talk about one of the first fandoms that I ever fell in love with, Star Wars. It is the 25th anniversary of the release of Star Wars Episode 1, and that got me thinking about the prequel trilogy. Star Wars sits in an interesting group of IPs where the way it's been released, the way it's been broken up, there's different iterations for different groups of people, different age brackets, stuff like that. Most people in my age bracket would call the prequel trilogy their Star Wars. For me, I grew up on the unadulterated original three. And I say it that way because I grew up with the VHSs before any of the alterations to the original movies were made. So to me, that will always hold that nostalgic home base feeling for me for my version of Star Wars. And maybe it's because, shout out to my other channel, Shell Shock, a TMNT series. I am very well aware of different IPs that have these different versions, these different storytelling opportunities, depending on who's behind the wheel. I mean, TMNT, Power Rangers, and others that essentially get a chance to take the core concept and tell different stories in different aspects. The thing about this is there was the unenviable task of setting up the world that led to that lived in world that by the time that this came out had been in existence for over 20 years. And when this came out, really only had Legends continuity to call from it, with talking about stories outside of the original world. And that's the expanded universe. At the time, obviously it wasn't known as Legends, but the books were really the major storytelling medium for extended Star Wars content. So this was uncharted territory. And let me tell you, I remember when this originally came out, the hype was real. People, the anticipation was real. Everybody was waiting to see what was going to happen with this trilogy that was supposed to give us the backstory behind Vader, the backstory behind the Emperor, setting up and expanding on the world that we had seen begun, but really fleshing out in a major way. And the reality is, if you were not aware, Star Wars fans have been known to be finicky. They've been known to be dramatic. It's kind of funny because there are newspaper clippings from the release of episode 5 that you would think were pulled from modern day. That it's the end of the Star Wars world. They've already lost the rabbit. It's already gone to pot, the whole 9 yards. So I do not mean to pick on the modern climate of Star Wars fandom, because the reality is this is a weird world because fans have always been hyper opinionated. And I think for Star Wars, a big reason for that is we're talking about, in a lot of ways, the genesis of what we now know as a space opera. This is a big dramatic series over 3 movies that tells this larger than life story in the backdrop of space in the larger galaxy. And this really wrote the book on what all of that looked like. So needless to say, there was a huge shadow that this movie already had to overcome, which had to have been a weird experience for George Lucas, because he's basically adding on to his own world. Usually it's an entirely different director that is adding on to somebody else's vision. And George Lucas famously knew that he was entering into the story partway through, that the wheels were already moving, the world was already lived in. And so when this was created, he basically said, like, yeah, there's other story to be told before this series of movies, but this is where we're picking up. And as a kid, having seen the original three, as a kid, having seen Vader in all of his bombastic nature, this larger than life, menacing, nothing stopping this dude sort of presentation, to then see Anakin, to see this dark and gritty storytelling livened up and more colorful, and at times silly, at times more lighthearted, to see what was over here more of a straightforward good versus evil story turned into a political thriller. As a kid, I didn't really like this movie. I was not really a fan. I was like, okay, this is fine, but give me my original three and I'm good. And I started finding the books at that time, and I'm like, okay, the good storytelling is happening over here. At this point, I already realized this is a big name IP. And so with that comes sequel after sequel after sequel. I was already a horror head. I was already well acquainted to the idea of let's drain an IP for every single cent that we can, and then move on once the well is dry. And so, and let alone things like Jar Jar Binks and the Gungans and all of that. I'm like, what is this queen have all over her face with her ridiculous hairstyle and all of that kind of stuff? There wasn't a lot of nuance to me as a kid in my tastes and things like that. And so I kind of moved on. The second one, the episode 2 came out, and I was at that point, invested enough in Star Wars that I was going to go see it because it was a Star Wars movie and all of that. So Mrs. Bearded Geek and I go to see this in theaters for the 25th anniversary. And I was curious. Now, mind you, over the years, I had revisited it some. I had revisited the prequel trilogy in an effort to watch everything leading up to the sequel trilogy. So I knew that I had softened some, but I really wanted to come in as much of a blank slate as I could. Because obviously I'm older. At this point, I've learned a bit more about storytelling. I'm a content creator. I'm in production. I've been in broadcasting for almost 10 years in some form or fashion. And I knew more than I did as a kid. And so I wanted to watch and see, okay, how does this movie 25 years on, being back in the light of the big screen, hold up? And let me tell you, I was shocked, stunned, and amazed at how well this movie holds up. Now, look, like I said, Star Wars fans, we're a finicky bunch. I get that. And to some, what I just said was a supremely controversial statement. We go back to every Star Wars fan has their Star Wars. And I will say the prequel trilogy has gained favor over time in the popular zeitgeist. By and large, most people are far more forgiving about some of the flaws in the storytelling, the dialogue, the character work that absolutely are present with the prequel trilogy, because we've seen other Star Wars now. We've seen how other Star Wars stories can go. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand. Some people, the sequel trilogy, that is your Star Wars. I will never understand that, but look, c'est la vie. So going into this, I'm watching it, blank slate. Guys, the cinematics, awesome. The storytelling, really, really good. The dialogue, stunted. The character work, stunted. So, by and large, I'm looking at this by any other measurable means. If I'm not comparing it to another movie that it's not, I'm walking out of the theater giving this movie at least a strong B plus, if not A minus, which is a huge leap forward in comparison to the last time that I watched that, let alone me watching it as a kid. So, what changed? What changed my opinion of this movie? Well, let's get into the plot synopsis before we go any further so that way we can break down the story as it's told. We start off again like the original three. We are winding back the clock from the original three, but we are still in a lived in world. Things are already happening because in the Star Wars mythos, we're telling stories like towards the tail end of the fleshed out time period. Well, tail end in a relative sense if we're talking about this the prequel trilogy, but definitely on from what has been set as ages that have happened before what we know as the Skywalker saga. And so this whole thing it's carrying the weight of the established Jedi Order, the established government, and all of these sorts of things. And so we pick up with political tension. The Trade Federation has upset the order of things in the Galactic Republic by blockading the planet of Naboo in secret preparation for a full-scale invasion. Now, remember, in the original three, the Emperor ruled the known galaxy, plus or minus some outlying worlds. In order to do that, you need to have a character that has been set up to control everything and amass that power. How are we going to get there? Through machinations, through long-term storytelling, through political power and struggle. So it shouldn't come as a huge shock that we are picking up in political tension. But I digress. Let's get back into it. The Republic's leader, Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum, dispatches Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn and his apprentice Obi-Wan Kenobi to negotiate with Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray. Darth Sidious, a Sith Lord and the Trade Federation's secret benefactor, orders the Viceroy to kill the Jedi and begin their invasion with an army of battle droids. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan escape and flee to Naboo. Amid the invasion, Qui-Gon rescues a bumbling Gungan outcast named Jar Jar Binks. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan fail to persuade the Gungan leader Boss Nass to aid the planet's surface dwellers, but manage to obtain Jar Jar's guidance and underwater transport to Theed, the capital city of Naboo. After rescuing Queen Padme Amidala, the group make their escape from Naboo aboard her royal starship, intending to reach the Republic capital planet of Coruscant. So already we are getting rapid fire set up. We're getting different people set up. The Nubians, we are getting the Gungans set up. We are getting the world and the Senate all set up. And we are seeing that Jedi are essentially a police force to be sent out on mission by the government. Along the way, the ship is damaged, passing through the Federation blockade, and the group lands for repairs on an outlying desert planet of Tatooine, situated beyond the Republic's jurisdiction. Qui-Gon Jar Jar and Astromech R2D2, along with Padme disguised as one of her handmaidens, visit the settlement of Mos Espa to purchase a new part for the hyperdrive. They encounter a junk dealer named Watto and his 9-year-old slave, Anakin Skywalker, a gifted pilot and engineer who has built a protocol droid, C-3PO. Qui-Gon senses a strong presence of the Force within young Anakin and is convinced, or I guess becomes convinced. I feel like I remember Qui-Gon always being convinced, but I feel like at first he's unsure that he is the prophesied chosen one, destined to restore balance to the Force. With Watto refusing to accept payment in Republic currency, Qui-Gon wagers both the required hyperdrive part and Anakin's freedom in a pod race. Anakin wins in one of the coolest scenes that, especially, again, given this came out in 99, y'all, the fact that this holds up the way that it does, not only Tatooine, like the way that Tatooine is presented here feels like a younger version of a planet that we see in the original 3, which is obviously exactly what it is. But think about this for a second. This is supposed to be a golden age. This is supposed to be a time where things are better. And then you fast forward to the Tatooine that we see in episode 4 and onward. It's way grittier, it's darker, it's a whole thing. And I just think they do an amazing job at not only the world, but seriously, this pod race, which Anakin wins and joins the group to be trained as a Jedi, leaving behind his mother, Shmi. En route to their starship, Qui-Gon is attacked by the sinister Darth Maul, Sidious's apprentice, who was sent to capture Amidala. After a brief lightsaber duel, Qui-Gon escapes on board the starship with the others. I remember how big of a deal Darth Maul was when this first came out, because not only is the makeup amazing, but a double-edged lightsaber, come on. That was, every kid wanted a double-edged lightsaber when they were growing up. That became the cool thing. And so Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan escort Padme to Coruscant so she can plead her people's case to Valorum and the Galactic Senate. Qui-Gon asks the Jedi Council for permission to train Anakin, and this is the first time that we get a younger Yoda. We get more characters fleshed out. We get Mace Windu for the first time, and the Council refuses. They're concerned that Anakin is vulnerable to the dark side of the Force. Unaffected and undaunted, Qui-Gon vows to train Anakin regardless of what the Council says. And there's an interesting exchange here between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon that, for as much as we're setting up the world, for as much as we're setting up the on-ramp for Darth Sidious's ascent to power, we're also setting up the systematic downfall of the Jedi Order, which is a bold move, Cotton. When you consider that the Jedi were the conquering heroes, Luke was the conquering hero of the original 3, we now have to take this paragon of virtue and show the fact that along the way, this became tainted and is absolutely part of the issue here. And Qui-Gon sets up that the Council is not the final authority, that he is willing to go outside of it. And Obi-Wan has this throwaway, well, a seemingly throwaway statement of the only reason why you're not on the council is because you keep getting into it with them. It's setting up Qui-Gon to be this figure that cares more about the Force and what the Force has to say than what the Council has to say. From here, Naboo Senator Palpatine persuades Amidala to call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum to elect a more capable leader to resolve the crisis. Though she is successful in pushing for the vote, Amidala grows frustrated with the corruption within the Senate and decides to return back to Naboo. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are ordered by the Jedi Council to accompany the Queen and investigate the return of the Sith, whom they had believed to be extinct for over a millennium, and they are not willing to accept that the Sith are back right away. This is not a simple exchange. And so back on Naboo, Padme reveals herself as the Queen before the Gungans and persuades them to join an alliance against the Trade Federation. It's funny because going back and watching this in theaters, I was keeping an eye on the background characters because I thought I remembered this, what was supposed to be a twist, which if you know what you're looking for, it's not really a twist. That Padme and her handmaiden go back and forth. Though I feel like I remember something that happened not in episode 1, which I'm curious if it happens in episode 2, but we'll see because I plan on watching that again. So Jar Jar is promoted to general and joins his tribe in a battle against the droid army, while Padme leads the search for Gunray in Theed. During a battle in the hangar, Anakin flees to a starfighter and accidentally triggers its autopilot, traveling to the battle against the Federation droid control ship and inadvertently causing its destruction from within, which deactivates the droid army. Meanwhile, the Duel of the Fates is happening. Darth Maul infiltrates the Theed Palace and engages with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan in a lightsaber duel. This back and forth, this beautiful dance of a fight takes place, and Maul would end up mortally wounding Qui-Gon before being bisected by Obi-Wan falling down a shaft. Before Qui-Gon dies, he asks Obi-Wan to train Anakin. Gunray is arrested by the Republic. Palpatine is elected Chancellor. Grandmaster Yoda promotes Obi-Wan to the rank of Jedi Knight and reluctantly accepts Anakin as Obi-Wan's apprentice. One of the things that's interesting to note is this movie ends on this scene where Obi-Wan and Anakin are talking at Qui-Gon's funeral. And this audio track is playing as we see Qui-Gon's body being burnt, as is custom for Star Wars. And if you go back and listen to it, it's a sped up version of the Imperial March, which I think is such a clever nod to what ultimately ends up happening, because I think one of the hardest obstacles that episode 1 had was A, not being immediately compared to episode 4, but B, setting the peg in the board for the timeline that you already know the end result of. When we see Anakin, we know that the eventuality is that this doesn't go well, that ultimately the Jedi fall, that ultimately Anakin falls, that this trilogy cannot close out on a particularly high note. And so it has this job of threading the needle of giving people something to look forward to, having something that isn't just down note from down note to down note, because ultimately people are going to lose interest in that. You have to give them a reason to come back and watch episode 2 and subsequently episode 3. Now, we got to talk about Jar Jar Binks and the comparisons that have taken place between Jar Jar and the Ewoks. Now, look, I am fully well aware of how problematic Ewoks have become over the years. I am fully well aware of how problematic in ways Jar Jar Binks is. That is not lost on me. But I think Jar Jar Binks gets an unfair amount of flack from the fan base. Yes, it's silly. Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's meant to be slapstick. Just like Anakin is meant to be a kid. Just like Obi-Wan is meant to be inexperienced. The council is meant to be blinded by the machinations of the government and everything. Just like the government is meant to be corrupted. Everything is intentionally placed the way that it is, because without all of that, you don't get 4, 5, and 6. And Jar Jar would go on to play a key role throughout this sequel trilogy. Now, mind you, I am team Jar Jar is a secret Sith. I think that adds so much flavor text to the world, and truth be told, George Lucas approached storytelling from a way that said, okay, I'm going to give you this. This is the story. Shade it in if you want. Allow for some shit. Now, there's been back and forth about whether or not Jar Jar was intended to be a bad guy and whatever, back and forth. But there's so much going on with the Star Wars world. And George Lucas was so willing to have other creators come in and add to the story that I don't think it betrays the original vision of George Lucas to say Jar Jar was a Sith, or to add on to the goings-on of the world by saying stuff like that, by having some fan theories and stuff like that. Now, mind you, a Jar Jar as a Sith leader book, we need that, yes please, and a double scoop for sure. Though I really feel like somebody trying to write out Jar Jar's linguistic patterns in book form would be really annoying to read. I don't know if it already exists, but if it does, more power to you for going and reading it. I've never read it, nor do I necessarily have any interest in trying to make heads or tails of that. And if they haven't, maybe don't. Anyway, I think there are individual components that make up this movie that have gotten an unfair treatment over the years. And it would seem like as time goes on, the court of public opinion has been softening on this. Like, I like to believe that as a people, we may have evolved past understanding like the flaws in and the problem of roasting a small child for his performance. For those of you that don't know, Jake Lloyd quit acting after this, and this gave him like trauma. Like, people were like hounding, and to the point where I was so glad when Avengers Endgame came out and people started giving the young actress who played Tony Stark's daughter, like, coming to her defense when some people were giving her crap and trying to roast her online and say like, no, this is a kid. Like, don't do this. And unfortunately, that didn't necessarily happen in the early 2000s when this kid was getting roasted for his performance. And I think people take IPs and their love of IPs far too seriously in a gatekeepy kind of way. And if your instinct is to roast a kid for his performance, then you go out and try to do it. Or like maybe, I don't know, get a hobby, get a pulse, get a job, get away from the computer and move away from consuming media for a minute until you can reconcile a person from a role. But I digress. When you look at his performance, it is childlike. It is whimsical. It is lighthearted because he's a friggin' kid. But all the while, it's emotional. Let's track here for a second. Okay, let's go with episode 4. Darth Vader going on a murderous rampage. Do we not think that takes emotionalism and an emotional person to go off on a murderous rampage, and an anger and hate fueled rampage? Why do we think that it would be a problem to have a young kid still emotional, but not tainted by the dark side yet? I don't get it. So I think he did a great job of setting the world up where Anakin gets a chance to grow up, gets a chance to experience life and experience the training of the Jedi as it is right now, because we are going to see a systematic failure of the Jedi in training this kid. It's this world where we have to build up who is going to end up our main antagonist for the next set of movies. And we need to stick that peg somewhere. So I personally think Jake Lloyd did an amazing job. I personally think Anakin is exactly who Anakin needs to be. And the little nods to what would end up leading him down this path of darkness are all starting to be established here. The fact that the Jedi Council is so blinded by politics that they are totally, woefully ignorant to the fact that the Sith are back, and that the head of the Sith has become the head of the government. That the Sith now control essentially the Jedi, because the Jedi listen to the governing body. I think overall, Padme grew on me as a leader. She's supposed to be young. She's supposed to be inexperienced. And when you stick her character into the full picture of what the prequel trilogy does and the way it sets up the character arc, I think it becomes a bit more forgiving, because her character can be a bit much at times. But to see how Palpatine is setting all of these pieces up for ultimately his gain, I think is chef's kiss in long-term storytelling. So throughout the way, we're seeing different effects and these different big bombastic scenes, and I think they hit it out of the park. I think they needed to come out swinging, and I think that's exactly what this movie did. Is the dialogue stunted at times in this movie? Absolutely. Famously, George Lucas was not very good at setting up dialogue and that aspect of things. He was more about, let me tell the grand story. And I think if you're looking at it from the story perspective, I think this does exactly what it needs to do and fits in quite well in the overall story of Star Wars. This movie does an impeccable job of setting up characters like C-3PO, R2-D2. Even the Hutts get a mention and a nod, and it sets up this world that we see fleshed out on into what we know as the Skywalker saga. And I have to give a shout out to Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine. He did such a good job of setting himself up as this big mustache twirling egomaniacal villain who was clever and secretive, and he set his performance in a way that he understood the thesis statement that an older, more experienced, more grizzled version of this character already exists and was already portrayed 20 plus years ago. So let's go ahead and do this in a way where this version of the character is believable to become that version of the character. And I think he does an impeccable job, as does Natalie Portman as Amidala, as Ewan McGregor, as Obi-Wan. I think he does a very good job of taking the beats of the established Obi-Wan character and trying to create essentially a whole new character around it, because we see limited Obi-Wan from the originals and some flushed out from the books, but really this is the first opportunity for Obi-Wan Kenobi to become established as his own character. And when you look at the original three and you see the fact that he is a little bit lighthearted, he is a bit sarcastic, but he is also emotional and he is also tortured in a way, we get that. And we get the building blocks of that in spades here from Ewan McGregor's performance. And of course, Liam Neeson as Qui-Gon. I was pissed as a kid. I was so mad as a kid when they killed Qui-Gon, because he was just, he did such an amazing job as this larger than life Jedi master that was smarter than everybody else, seemed to be more powerful than everybody else. And now I understand that when you look at the grand picture, he needed to die in order for the story to be told, but frustrating to say the least. And I'm just glad that his character kind of got some closure in a way with what they've done since, with establishing that he is the first one to introduce this idea of being able to commune with the Force, keep your body, and be able to come back as a Force ghost. And they kind of retrofitted that it was actually Qui-Gon that taught Yoda how to do all of that, even though he only learned at the final moments, or didn't really get a chance to learn how to do it in its full and complete sense. So we don't see Qui-Gon as a full-on Force ghost, but he's able to teach these other characters how to become Force ghosts. And then we have our background characters: Anthony Daniels, C-3PO, Kenny Baker, R2-D2, Pernilla August as Shmi, and Frank Oz as Yoda. All do amazing jobs. I think Shmi is this character that is willing, like the way that they give Anakin an anchor in her, I think her acting is really well done. I just wish between this one and the next one, we got more time with her as a character, but she's more of a means and a vehicle, kind of like Qui-Gon in that way, to push forward the story and establish the wheels moving forward for Anakin to get trained and for everything to take place. So, guys, I can't tell you that every single conversation is going to come with a glowing review like this one. We're going to have to talk about the good and the bad as we continue to work our way through the Star Wars saga as well as other movies. But this movie, I gotta give it its flowers. Honestly, a strong B+. I'll even go as far as to say maybe even an A- for this entry into the Star Wars saga. What I want you guys to do is chime in below. Let me know what you want to talk about next. Until next time, guys, peace.